The sulfur hit Marin Voss first, a low chemical burn at the back of the throat, the kind that made your eyes want to close, whether you wanted them to or not. She breathed through her mouth and kept moving through the dark between the server stacks, following the faint blue pulse of the emergency lighting that someone had jury-rigged to the backup generator 3 weeks ago when the Veth had taken the grid. She had a wrench in her right hand and a stolen neural scanner in her left, and neither felt like enough. Outside, the city of Karath made the sounds a city makes when something very large is walking through it without caring what it steps on. Vibrations moved through the floor in long, slow intervals. Footsteps. She knew the rhythm by now. She'd spent enough time cataloging the Veth's movement patterns in the weeks since they dropped through the clouds over the eastern seaboard to know that the particular cadence she was feeling meant a siege-class walker. Not the small reconnaissance units they sent through the streets, the kind that shook windows 3 blocks away and left craters in hardened concrete. That meant they knew something was here worth destroying. She cut left around a transformer housing and found the door to the secondary lab still intact. The biometric lock was long dead. Someone, her father probably, because her father's solution to everything was to dismantle it and rebuild it from first principles, had placed it with a manual deadbolt and a length of cable. She unwound the cable, pushed through. The smell inside was different, less sulfur, more ozone, more coolant, and underneath both of those, something organic she didn't have a word for in any language she spoke. It was the smell the Veth gave off when they were working, when they were thinking. The containment held, said a voice from the dark. She almost threw the wrench before she recognized it as Oscar's. He was crouched next to the central processing array, one hand on the housing, the other holding a small handheld light he'd angled down toward the floor so it wouldn't bleed under the door. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. Everyone did. The containment held, she repeated. And what's inside it? Oscar moved the light. Caught a capsule at the center of the room. A pressurized cylinder, roughly the size and shape of a burial urn, threaded through with monitoring leads that connected to a battered portable display bolted to the cart beside it. The display showed waveforms, slow, unmistakably alive. Preserved neural tissue, Oscar said. Veth recovered it from the unit that Sergeant Caro's team put down in the transit tunnel 3 days ago. The brain, essentially. The thing that functions as one. Marin looked at the waveforms for a long moment. It's still active, still active. You've been sitting in here alone with a living Veth brain. I've been sitting in here alone with a significant scientific opportunity. He said it without apology, the way he said everything he believed completely, and she recognized the cadence. It was her father's cadence, the same flat certainty that had driven Heinrich Voss to spend 23 years studying xenobiology before the Veth had arrived, and made his life, suddenly, catastrophically relevant. Her father was dead now. He'd gone back to the university complex to retrieve his research archives after First Wave. He hadn't come back. What remained of his work was in this room. I want to see the journals, she said. The journals were handwritten in her father's small, precise script, with margin notes in 3 different colors of ink that corresponded to 3 different stages of revision. Marin had grown up watching him annotate his own work. The red ink for initial observation, the blue for second pass correction, the green for what he called integration, the stage where a finding stopped being a finding and started being part of a framework. The last pages were almost entirely green. She read for an hour while Oscar monitored the capsule, and the walker outside made its slow circuit of the block. The building shook twice, then went still. Somewhere above them, something structural shifted and resettled with a sound like a building, clearing its throat. Her father had theorized, had more than theorized, had documented, had built a technical framework around the possibility that Veth consciousness was not architecture-dependent, that their neural tissue didn't require their specific biology to function, that the cognitive substrate could, in principle, be interfaced with compatible hardware, or, in the specific and extraordinary margin note on page 147, with a compatible nervous system. She read the page 3 times. Then she sat still for a while with the journal closed in her lap, listening to the bass rhythm of the walker, and thinking about what the word compatible actually meant. When you stripped away everything her father's careful green ink made it sound like. He wanted to try it on himself, she said eventually. That's my reading of the notes, yes. He thought that if you could establish a working interface between human neural architecture and a living Veth brain, you'd have access to their cognition, their perception architecture, the way they process tactical and spatial information, the way they communicate. Oscar paused. The way they think about us. That's insane. Your father was not insane. I know he wasn't insane. I'm saying the idea is insane. The idea is extraordinarily dangerous and probably not survivable in any form he described, Oscar said. It was a different thing, and they both knew it. But the capsule is stable. The tissue is viable. And whatever that Walker is looking for out there, it is going to find it eventually. Or it is going to level this building. And the result for us is the same either way. Marin set the journal down on the cart beside the display and looked at the waveforms. They moved with a quality she could only describe as intent. Not random, not noise, organized. Whatever was in that capsule was doing something. Else knows about this, she asked. Sergeant Caro. She's the one who brought me the specimen. She doesn't know what I've been doing with it. Get her. Sergeant Dia Caro had a reputation in what remained of Careth's civilian resistance for being the kind of person who listened to proposals fully before saying no. This was considered, in the current environment, a significant virtue. She sat on a crate in the corner of the secondary lab, with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, while Oscar explained what he'd built and what he believed it could do, and she listened without interrupting all the way to the end. Then she said, "No, Sergeant. I've heard it. The answer is no. The neural interface is non-invasive. The connection would be temporary. Marin is trained in. I heard the part where it's non-invasive and temporary. I also heard the part where we don't actually know that, because your only reference point is notes written by a man who never got to test the theory." Caro looked at Marin. "You understand what he's asking you to do." "I understand what I'm asking myself to do," Marin said. "This was my father's work. I'm not doing it because Oscar wants me to. I'm doing it because that thing outside is not going to stop, and none of our weapons are stopping it. And if there is the smallest chance that we can understand how they think, what they're looking for, what they're afraid of, how they communicate in the field, then we have to try. And if the interface goes wrong, you and Oscar are the only people who will know this room existed. You'll have the journals, you'll have the research. That doesn't disappear." Caro was quiet for a long time. The walker made another pass outside, close enough that the portable display rattled on its cart. 5 minutes, Caro said finally. "You give me a clear signal at the 5-minute mark, and I disconnect you manually. Whatever you've learned by then is what we have." Agreed. And Marin. Caro waited until she had her full attention. "If it goes wrong in the other direction, if whatever's in there comes back with you, I will not let that out of this room." Marin looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. She sat down in the chair Oscar had bolted to the floor in the center of the room. To the cluster of sensor leads he'd routed from the capsule to the secondary array, to the contact points at her temples and the base of her skull. He'd done the calibration over 3 days. He'd been frighteningly thorough. That was something. That he'd been frightening himself with the thoroughness of what he'd prepared. And he'd kept preparing it anyway. She thought about her father's green ink. Integration, the stage where a finding stopped being a finding and started being part of a framework. "Ready," she said. Oskitz initiated the sequence. It was not dark. She had expected dark. She had expected some version of being nowhere, transit between states of consciousness, something she could describe afterward as a threshold moment. Instead, it was the opposite. A sudden, overwhelming brightness of data, of signal, of organized perception that had nothing to do with her own senses and everything to do with the thing in the capsule, the Veth brain. She could not think of it as Veth any longer, because the Veth had a word for themselves that she now knew, and it was nothing like the sound humans had assigned to them. Was not sleeping. It had not been passive in the capsule. It had been waiting. It recognized contact. She felt that recognition the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not as a thought, not as communication, as a physical fact about the space she now occupied. Something had noticed her. She tried to stay herself. This was the instruction she'd given herself before the sequence began. Stay yourself. Know your edges. Don't mistake borrowed perception for your own. The borrowed perception was extraordinary. The Veth didn't see in wavelengths she had names for, perceived electromagnetic fields in real time. The entire electromagnetic geography of a space, updated constantly, mapped against thermal signatures and chemical traces, and something she could only describe as pressure reading, awareness of force vectors, in 3 dimensions, that gave them a tactical picture of their environment that no human sensor array had ever produced. She could feel it layering over her own visual input like a second set of eyes that looked at everything at once. Through those eyes, she could feel the building. She could feel the walker outside. She could feel its field signature, its heat bloom, the specific vibrational pattern of its motivator systems. And underneath those mechanical readings, she could feel the consciousness inside it, distant, ordered, confident in a way that had no doubt in it, the way a machine is confident, the way a process is confident. It was looking for something. The capsule, the preserved neural tissue of one of its own, not because it grieved. The Veth didn't grieve, because the tissue was a resource, and what Oscar had done with it was a violation of resource protocol, and the Walker's directive was recovery and sanitation. And the word for sanitation in the Veth's cognitive architecture was a concept she felt in chest like cold water, because it included her and Oscar and Caro and every living thing in this building. She tried to push deeper. She needed to know how they communicated. She needed to know the architecture of the signal. The contact resistance she felt next was like touching a hot surface. Not pain. The Veth brain had a different relationship to pain than she did, but a sharp, reflexive awareness of boundary. Of something the consciousness in the capsule did not want approached. She pushed anyway. Boundary broke, and she saw the network. What she brought back took 3 days to articulate fully, and she could only articulate portions of it. And some of those portions she made Caro write down because she couldn't say them in any language she had words for and could only gesture at the shapes of them, but the core of it was this. The Veth communicated through a distributed signal architecture that had no central command node. Every unit was a relay point. Every unit was also a receiver and an interpreter. The signal that moved between them was not language. It was state sharing, a continuous broadcast of situational perception that allowed any Veth within range to understand any other Veth's immediate environment, as if they occupied the same body. This was why human tactics didn't work on them. Human tactics assumed a command structure that could be disrupted. The Veth didn't have a head to cut off, but the signal had a frequency, a specific mappable frequency. And if you could introduce noise into that frequency at sufficient amplitude, you could blind them, Caro said. She said it very quietly. Not blind them. But you could make them locally incoherent. They'd still function individually. The shared perception architecture, the part that sticks more than the sum of their units in the field, you could disrupt that. Temporarily. How long? Long enough. If the disruption were introduced at the right point in an engagement, if we knew where to put it. Marin paused. I know where to put it. I could feel the signal nodes in the Walker's architecture. They're external. They're exposed because they've never had to protect them. They've never encountered anything that could threaten them. Caro was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Oscar and said, "Can you build it?" "I can build something," Oscar said carefully. "I'd need the frequency data she mapped. I'd need 3 days and access to the RF equipment in the comms room upstairs. And I'd need to know that the emission could be aimed, not broadcast. We don't want to light up a kilometer radius and tell them exactly where we would." "Directional," Marin said. "There's a reflector configuration that would work. Parabolic." She hesitated. "I can show you the geometry." "I don't. I can see it. I don't know if I can explain where the knowledge comes from." "It came from the interface," Oscar said. Yes, he was looking at her the way she'd seen him look at her father's journals, that careful, specific attention, the kind that was cataloging. "Are you yourself?" She thought about the question seriously before answering it. She thought about the borrowed perception, which was still partially present, Faint double overlay on her own senses that she'd been trying to parse as separate from herself, and mostly succeeding. She thought about the cold water feeling of the Veth word for sanitation, and how it sat in her chest differently now than it had during the interface. It had lost its shape. It was just a fact, not a threat. I myself, she said. I'm also someone who spent 4 minutes in a Veth consciousness. And I don't think that goes away completely, but I'm myself. Oscar nodded slowly. Then let's build it. The walker made 3 more circuits before it left. Marin tracked it through the borrowed perception for as long as she could feel it, which grew shorter over the next few days. As the interface residue faded, she used the time while it was still clear to map everything she could remember. The signal architecture, the frequency bands, the node configurations, the specific vulnerability in the external relay cluster that she'd felt like a loose thread in a fabric. She drew diagrams on the backs of her father's journal pages, the blank ones at the end, felt something catch in her throat about that, and let it catch and kept drawing. Caro came and went, running the resistance network through back channels and relay drops us, bringing news that was never good, and sometimes not as catastrophic as expected. The Veth were consolidating. They were withdrawing from the outer districts and concentrating resources in the city center. This was being interpreted by most people as a preparation for a final push. Marin thought it meant something else. She thought, based on what she'd felt in the walker's cognitive architecture, that the Veth were sensing something anomalous and pulling inward to triangulate it. They could feel the noise of the capsule in their network, a dead relay point, a gap in the signal geography, and they were trying to locate the gap's source. We're running out of time, she told Caro.
We've been running out of time since the first wave.
I mean specifically. I think they know there's a breach in their signal network, and they're using that knowledge to narrow a search grid. If they find the grid center, they'll find us. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3 if the resistance activity in the northern district is pulling their attention. Then Oscar needs to be done in 2 days. He was done in 2 days and 1 night. He slept for 4 hours somewhere in there, and Marin slept for less. Lying on a cot they'd set up in the secondary lab because she didn't want to be away from the capsule. She'd told herself this was about monitoring. Partly it was. Partly it was the feeling she had now of the Veth brain as something she understood. Something that had let her in and shown her its architecture. Something for which she felt an obligation she didn't have a clean word for. She thought about her father's margin notes in the blue ink, the second-pass corrections, the ones where he'd pushed back against his own initial observations. One of them, on page 89, simply said, "The fact of understanding something does not obligate you to preserve it. But you should know the difference between preservation and use." She had not preserved the Veth brain. She had used it. She had taken from it the knowledge that might let them survive. And now the capsule sat in its containment in the secondary lab while Oscar finished his emitter in the comms room upstairs. And Caro coordinated the resistance cells that would have to execute whatever plan Marin brought them. She sat next to the capsule one last time before they moved. The waveforms on the display were still organized, still purposeful, still doing whatever it was the consciousness inside was doing. She couldn't interface with it again. The leads were unrigged, and she wasn't sure her nervous system could take a second session anyway, not without days of calibration. But she sat with it. She thought her father would have too. "I don't know what you were," she said quietly. "In whatever this was before, I know what you are to us now." The waveforms moved. She didn't know if that was response or coincidence. She chose, in her father's tradition of green ink integration, to include it in the framework and move on. The plan Caro vetted and approved in its final form had 6 components, and the one that mattered most was also the simplest. Position the emitter at the geometric center of the Vethith signal network as it existed in the northern district, activated at maximum directional output during the coordination window between the 2 closest walker units, and give the resistance cells exactly 90 seconds of Veth incoherence to do what 90 seconds of Veth incoherence had never before been possible to do. The walkers were vulnerable or seconds at every coordination interval. The interval was predictable. The node placement that would disrupt the interval required a line-of-sight position from the top of the Kareth Communications Relay Tower, which was exposed, which was guarded by Veth reconnaissance units, and which required someone to carry a 40-kilogram emitter up 19 flights of stairs while the Veth search grid narrowed. Caro volunteered immediately. Marin told her she was needed for command coordination and volunteered instead. They argued for 6 minutes, which was 6 minutes they didn't have, and resolved it by having Oscar point out that Marin was the only one who could verify node alignment in the field using the spatial geometry sheet mapped from the interface. And Caro was the only one who had enough authority with the resistant its cells to execute the 90-second window without it collapsing into chaos. Both of these facts were true. Marin had made sure of that before the argument started. She and Oscar went up the tower. Caro went to her cells. The stairs were concrete and damaged, with stretches where the Veth's initial bombardment had fractured them into a diagonal scramble that required both hands, and a willingness to put significant trust in crumbling infrastructure. Oscar carried the emitter in 2 pieces, and Marin carried both weapons and the interface maps, folded into the breast pocket of her jacket, next to a photograph she'd been carrying since the day her father didn't come back. She didn't look at the photograph. She knew what it looked like. They passed 2 Veth reconnaissance units on the stairwell. Small models, roughly 2 meters tall, with the smooth, featureless faceplanes that had appeared in so many news broadcasts before the news broadcasts stopped. She felt them before she saw them through the faint residue of borrowed perception that still overlaid her senses like a watermark. Warm, organized, locked on task. The first one they got past by pressing into a shattered doorframe on the 11th floor and waiting while it passed at the far end corridor, its attention directed outward through a blown-out window at whatever was happening in the street below. The second one they didn't get past quietly. Oscar took the hit from its deflection field and went down hard against the wall, and Marin used the 3 seconds the unit spent recalibrating its threat assessment to do something that she had calculated. Really calculated, specific reference to the spatial geometry she'd mapped from the interface. Would work at close range if she hit the external relay cluster on the unit's upper right quadrant. It worked. The unit went still. Not destroyed. The relay disruption wasn't permanent on a single unit scale, but incoherent for long enough that she got to Oscar and got him to his feet, and they covered the last 8 flights fast, with him leaning on her and both of them breathing too hard for quiet. The top floor of the relay tower was open on 3 sides. Fourth was the housing for the relay antenna itself, a structure of steel and ceramic that had survived the bombardment because the Veth had specifically not targeted it. They'd left the communications infrastructure intact, which her father had theorized was because the electromagnetic profile of active relay towers was part of their spatial navigation framework. Standing in the tower was being inside the Veth's map of the world. She could feel that clearly through the borrowed perception. For a moment it was overwhelming, the city laid out in signal in field geometry, in the overlapping electromagnetic voices of everything they'd built and everything they'd brought with them. And at the center of it, a precise and awful and mappable gap, where the capsule sat in the secondary lab and broadcast silence. She pulled herself back to the emitter. Oscar was assembling it, with hands that shook from the impact and didn't stop him. She aligned the reflector dish to the angle she'd calculated, while he ran the power coupling. And they did it without talking, because the wind at this height was significant, and also because there wasn't anything to say. The plan was either going to work, or it wasn't, and they'd know in about 4 minutes. Caro's signal came up on the handset. Ready. Marin checked the alignment one more time. She thought about the node configuration she'd felt in the Walker's relay cluster, the loose thread, the exposed edge, the thing the Veth had never had to protect. She thought about her father writing in green ink at the margins of observations that had taken him 20 years, and she thought about the fact that he'd been right, and that the people who'd been in the position to use his being right were his daughter and a physician who built RF emitters in the dark. She thought he would have liked this. He would have had 17 concerns about the methodology, but he would have liked this. She keyed the handset. Execute. Three things happened in close sequence. Caro transmitted the execution signal to the 6 resistance cells. Marin triggered the emitter, and 90 seconds of Veth incoherence opened like a window over the northern district, and the resistance cells went through it. She heard the 90 seconds from 19 stories up, not as discrete sounds, because the city had its own acoustic geography of echo and interference, but as a change in the city's voice. The organized, mechanical sounds the Veth made in the field, the subsonic coordination signals, the motivator harmonics of the walkers, percussion of a controlled occupation, fractured into a different register. Not chaos but disruption, a city that had been speaking in one voice briefly going to pieces. Then the 90 seconds ended. Marin killed the emitter, the window closed. Oscar sat down on the relay tower floor with his back against the antenna housing and looked at the sky, which was the particular damaged gray of a city that had been burning for weeks. She sat next to him. They didn't speak. Below them, somewhere in the northern district, 6 resistance cells were either pulling back to safe positions or they weren't. The handset crackled. Caro's voice came through, short and factual. 3 walkers down. Relay node at the municipal center gone. Signal architecture in the northern district is fragmented. They're pulling back. Marin closed her eyes. They'll adapt, Caro continued. They'll figure out what we did, and they'll adjust their node placement and their relay architecture, and the next window will be shorter, or they'll harden their external relays or both. We have a lead, not a victory. I know, Marin said. What do you need to extend the lead? She opened her eyes. Below the tower, the city was still gray, still broken, still occupied. She could feel, through the faint watermark of borrowed perception, a change in the Veth signal geography. A scramble, a recalibration, quality of attention that something gives to a problem it hadn't expected to have. She thought about the gap in their network where the capsule sat and broadcast silence. She thought about the fact that her father had spent 23 years learning how to understand something, and that understanding had turned out to be the most dangerous thing in the world. Not dangerous for her, dangerous for the things that had assumed they were incomprehensible. Time, she said. I need time, and access to the rest of his journals, and Oscar functioning with both hands. Give me that, and I'll give you more windows. How many more? She thought about the green ink. Integration. The stage where a finding stopped being a finding and started being part of a framework. Enough, she said. In the weeks that followed, the Veth did adapt. They hardened their relay nodes, rotated their coordination intervals on variable timings, reduced the predictability of their walker patterns in the northern district. But they adapted to what they'd encountered, which was the first version of the emitter, first configuration. The first set of windows Marin had mapped from a 4-minute interface with a single captured consciousness. By then, she was on the 3rd iteration of both the hardware and the maps. Pro ran the resistance cells with an efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting for something that actually worked. And now that she had it, she was going to extract maximum function from every working hour. Marin ate when Oscar put food in front of her and slept. When the borrowed perception got noisy enough that she couldn't parse her own thoughts. The overlay. She was learning, gradually, to use the residue as a tool, rather than managing it as an intrusion, to ask it questions and read the quality of its the way you read signal on a scope. It wasn't communication. The consciousness in the capsule was not a collaborator. She never let herself think of it that way, because that was how you stopped being useful, and started being the thing that made Caro very quiet and watchful. But it was data. Extraordinarily specific, continuously available data about the cognition of something that had arrived at Earth with the assumption that nothing here would understand it. Page 147 of the journals. The brain of a man who'd thought carefully enough about an alien intelligence that he'd mapped the conditions under which a human mind might interface with it. Who'd been right about the conditions, who hadn't survived to see what being right meant. She worked with both his methodology and his caution. She did not attempt a second interface, not because she was afraid of it, but because once was enough to gather what she'd gathered, and her father's blue ink had been very clear on this point. Don't optimize for more data when you have sufficient data. Optimize for application. She applied it. The third window was 40 seconds longer than the 90. The fourth was nearly 3 minutes. Fifth time, the VETH coordination architectures in Karath went incoherent. Caro's cells took out 11 walkers, 2 atmospheric relay platforms, and the central coordination hub that had been directing the occupation of the city center. The VETH withdrew from Karath, not defeated, not destroyed, but unable, in the current configuration of their signal architecture, to maintain the coordination density required for occupation while simultaneously processing the disruption events. They pulled back to the coast, to the water, to the positions they'd established before the ground campaign. Morin tracked their signal geography from the relay tower with a clarity that felt, in the borrowed perception overlay, like watching something back away from a fire. She didn't know what they would do next. She knew they would do something. She knew the windows would get shorter, and then they would close, and then she would have to find another thread to pull. She sat with the capsule on the night the VETH withdrew, in the secondary lab with the portable display showing its slow organized waveforms, and she thought about her father. He'd wanted to understand. That was the whole project. Not to defeat, not to weaponize, but to understand, because understanding was what he believed in the way other people believed in things you could hold. He'd built a framework around the possibility of contact between human cognition and something radically other, and he'd been right, and the application of his being right had been a weapon. She didn't think he would have minded. He had been whatever else he was, a practical man. She thought about the word for sanitation in the VETH cognitive architecture, the cold water feeling of it, the way it had included her in its scope. She thought about the fact that she had existed in a VETH consciousness and been perceived as an anomaly, not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a thing that should not have been possible and therefore required correction. They had thought humans were a solved problem. They had thought there was nothing here that could look back. He would have written something very good in green ink about this, she said to the capsule. He would have had a word for it. Something in that framework. The waveforms moved. She closed her father's journal, the last page filled with green ink that she'd been adding to for 3 weeks now. In her own hand, in his tradition, she tucked it into her jacket pocket next to the photograph. Then she went upstairs to find Oscar, because there was work to do, and the VETH were adapting, and she needed to adapt faster. And the only way to do that was to keep reading the signal, and keep building, and keep finding the threads in their architecture that they'd never thought to protect because they'd never had a reason to. They had a reason now. She gave it to them. That was, she thought, a specifically human thing to do, to reach into the unknown, to bring something back from it, and to use what you found there not to become it, but to remain yourself while knowing it. That was the line. That was what her father's framework had been about, underneath all the careful green ink. Not the interface, not the weapon, not the windows in the signal, the staying. In the distance, over the gray horizon of the coast, the VETH signal architecture pulsed and reorganized and tried, in its brilliant collective way, to compute what had happened to it. Erin climbed the stairs. She had maps to redraw,